Really?
Yeah. I'm still learning that one. It's the first time. It's not the first time I've been a bridesmaid. It was bridesmaid when my dad married my stepfather. But I was going to be a bridesmaid, and I was quite big. So I didn't know very much. Except show off and look pretty. Yeah, maybe that's fine. But obviously, no one can't help get there. Can you do? Oh god. I probably will for my brother. If you trust me, that's all. Yeah.
Okay. Right, good morning everyone. Bore da pawb. Croeso, welcome to session 5 excuse me, of the module. Just a quick recap then, 2 weeks today now then, which will be Monday the 9th of March. We've got the in-class test, so that's starting to come round quite quickly now, which I am quite conscious that it's getting ever closer. So what I would say, if anyone's got anything that they've done as yet, and realistically there's no reason that you should have done by today, but if you've got anything that you want me to take a look at, we've got some time after we finish today. Alternatively, if you want to bring with you what you've done next week, and then we can go through it in a bit more depth, and then realistically, as I said, on Monday the 9th of March, then you will need to be able to access what you've done up until that point, and then all you'll be doing will be making any suggested tweaks based on the 3 learners that you're going to meet on the day, or potentially it might be a case of going back in and adding more specific justification for what you've already done. So just as a quick reminder then, the session plan, we had a look at the template which is up on Canvas. I've pinched that one from the PGC at Swansea. There's no reason why a lesson plan has to look that way, but I've kind of pinched it from there to give you a bit of an idea in terms of structure. And as we said before, then entirely up to you what age range you want to pitch that at, entirely up to you what the makeup of the class would be. So Flo, you could do it as a PRU class if you wanted to, or a nurture group, or it could be a mainstream class, it could be primary, it could be secondary, it could be special school, it could be FE, it could be a university class if you want to. It doesn't really make any difference. And then what you're asked to think about is what would be the kind of topic that you would deliver within your fictional 1-hour lesson. So realistically, it can be anything, but it has to be, I suppose, something that would be appropriate for the age range that you've picked. So you're not necessarily going to do anything about the psychology behind serial killers with kind of year 1 classes, for example. All right? So just make sure it's kind of relevant to the age range. And then the key things that will be on your lesson plan really would be, how would you set out your 1 hour? So thinking about traditionally, perhaps you've kind of got an introduction, you've got a starter activity, you've got the main thing the class are doing, and then you've got something at the end as a plenary to tie it all together. So what might you do in your planned session? And how would you go about delivering it, and what is it you'd be asking your made-up learners to do? Okay, so that's what the lesson plan itself is looking at. And as we said, there's no word count on the lesson plan itself. You can go into as much detail or as little detail as you want. However, I would say if you've got a bit more rather than a bit less detail on there, it does help get your points across. Okay. The other part that you have to do then is the 1,000 word justification, and that justification I suppose has got a few different elements to it. So you could justify very briefly at the start why you've picked that topic if you wanted to. However, what the key thing you're justifying is the approaches to teaching and learning that you've chosen, and what you will then be doing is making a further reference as to how you've tweaked or already thought about the 3 unnamed learners that you're going to meet on the day. Now, I've shown you some examples of those one-page profiles previously. They're going to look very similar to those, so there's nothing that's out of the ordinary or nothing that's hopefully going to throw you on the day. And we have said in particular that the fact that we're looking at dyslexia, autism, ADHD and sensory and physical needs between now and the in-class test might be a good indication as to what needs to start to think about going forward. Okay, so although you haven't met the learners as yet, you might want to start looking at, what is effective support for learners with dyslexia in the classroom, or what are some of the things you might need to think about that we'll talk about later today if one of the learners was autistic, for example. Okay, so as I said, that's 1,000 words. Potentially you could write 700 words plus of that before you come to the test itself. Okay, so thinking about how you're going to set your fictitious lesson up. Are you going to be doing group work, for example? If so, entirely fine, not a problem with that, but why are you doing group work? How are you going to put the groups together? Are they going to be friendship groups? Are they going to be set by ability? Can you justify the choice you've made? And realistically, whatever you pick on your lesson plan, you can justify it. There's no right or wrong answer, as long as you can explain the how and the why. Other things you might want to think about, as we've said before, are things like, are you going to have a teaching assistant or assistants in your classroom? If yes, fab. How would the teaching assistant relationship work with those learners? Are they going to be supporting the 3 specific learners you're going to meet on the day? Are there going to be more than one teaching assistant which float around the classroom and support everyone? Are they going to be working with particular groups, for example? And then other things, I suppose, are going to be a bit more specific to what your topic is. So are you going to be using technology at all? So if you're going to be doing a literacy activity, for example, will you also have iPads available for those learners who might struggle with physical handwriting, for example? If you are giving out handouts, are they all going to be on the same colour paper? So just think about those general things, seating plans, all those general things in the classroom. And then, as I said, on the day you will see those 3 learners. Excuse me, my voice isn't great this morning. You'll see those 3 learners on the day. All of them will have their strengths, their interests and the things they find challenging. And potentially you will have already thought about these things, even though you won't have met them until Monday the 9th. You might already have put something in place in your session plan where you go, actually, I'm just going to make up a name now, that would meet Tom's needs. Don't need to do anything else. But in the justification, you can expand further as to why that does already meet Tom's needs, for example. Or maybe there is something which does throw a bit of a curveball or a bit of a spanner in the works, and you've gone, right, okay, I actually need to think a little bit more about that now. On the day, as I said, it's going to be in the little computer lab over at the bottom of the Kia Hardy building, so I'll pop all this up on Canvas next week. I'll put pictures showing where the room is and everything. It's the smallest lab I could find. It's only got 8 PCs in it, so it's going to be quite snug, but hopefully not quite as formal as last year's group that was in an 80 to 100 PC lab doing this. And it's going to be as informal as we can make it, so bring in drinks and snacks as normal. The only thing that is different, I suppose, is that it's under exam conditions, in the sense that you're not allowed to talk to each other as you're doing it. But other than that, it's not going to be anything particularly out of the ordinary. Okay, so between now and then, anything that you want me to take a look at, it doesn't matter how draft it is at that point. It might just be, by the end of this week, you've started to think about what the lesson is going to be, and you want to check next Monday, does it seem okay? Or you might be a little bit further ahead in that and you want me to take a look at what you've written in terms of the justification. So whatever position you're in, I would say by trying to think of date now, by Friday the 5th or Friday the 6th of March, if you let me know how you're getting on and if there's anything you want me to take a look at before you come on the Monday. All right. So any questions or concerns about that? No. So the only thing I would say is just make sure you've got access to the document that you've done in multiple ways, just in case. So put it on a USB, email it to yourself, stick it on your university OneDrive. There have been people in the past who've kind of put it somewhere and have really struggled to access it on the day because technology wasn't particularly their friend at the time. So whatever you can do to make your life easier on the day, just think about that in advance. All right. Okay, so if anyone's got anything they want me to look at the end of today, we'll have to go somewhere else because there's another class in here straight after us, but we can go and sit and discuss whatever you want to go over. So what we're going to look at today then, last week we tried to get all sorts of things about dyslexia into one particular session. And we talked a little bit about dyslexia causes, dyslexia in terms of assessment, dyslexia in terms of supportive strategies potentially, and some of the difficulties that a learner who is dyslexic might experience realistically because they are a dyslexic person who is in a non-dyslexic environment. So we're going to recap that a little bit this morning. We're then going to move on very briefly to think about another broad area of need, which is communication and interaction. Now, in particular here, we're thinking about speech and language needs, which is the most common area of ALN in Wales. However, we're going to focus a little bit more specifically on autism. So ASD, neurodiversity or neurodivergence, potentially thinking about different terminology. And what we're going to think a little bit about this morning is how might a learner who is autistic, how might they experience a school classroom? What might be some of the challenges they face? What might be some of the things we can put in place that's supportive? And potentially there are things that we're going to discuss today which could fit well if one of your learners happen to have autism on the day of the test. Okay, and then we're also going to very briefly introduce some examples of communication strategies. Now, some of you may have come across these before, and in particular we're going to focus on something called social stories. We'll also very briefly mention things like PECS and Makaton, for example, but we're going to take a look at social stories as an example of support in communication and understanding as we get closer to the end of the session. Okay, so last week then, as I said, we tried to fit a lot about dyslexia into a short session. So we talked about the fact that about 20% of the American population is seen as being dyslexic, somewhere between 10 and 15% in the UK, depending upon what organisation you look at, about 6 to 7% perhaps in France, maybe 3% in Italy. And one of the common things we said was that there were more people who've been diagnosed with dyslexia in countries that speak English compared to others that don't, including Wales, for example, with Welsh medium learners, and that may be for a number of different reasons. So one of them, potentially, this is where the largest amount of research about dyslexia has taken place. So the UK, US and Canada in particular, but also increasingly in Australia and Singapore, partly because the majority, if not all, of the dyslexia assessment tests that we use are in the English language, and it could also be in part to do with the English language itself. So we talked about the fact last week that English as a language is quite complicated, about 500,000 words in common usage compared to about 90,000 words in French, for example. A lot of our words come from different language and writing systems globally, and one of the key challenges we had was 26 letters in the alphabet, so 26 graphemes to spell at least 40 different sounds, phonemes. So some countries have what they call a consistent grapheme-phoneme correspondence. In other words, every time you want to write that sound, you spell it in exactly the same way. However, in English, we don't. And as we said, we've got 5 vowels in English. They make 10 sounds between them, and we can spell the 5 vowels in about 36 different ways. So the English language itself is complicated. So we also said last time that we've known about dyslexia since the 1870s, so about 150 years now, but there are still all sorts of debates that we see in the news and the papers about this. So there are debates as to whether it actually exists or not. There are debates around the definition. Is it too inclusive? In other words, do we include learners under the definition who aren't dyslexic? Is it too exclusive? Are we missing out on those learners in particular who show the majority of the dyslexic traits, but perhaps have learnt strategies to support their reading, writing and spelling? So are we missing some learners? And then what we also said was, what we can't agree on what causes it, and we have the 3 main theories of causation. And when we think about those theories, each of them alone probably explains a bit of dyslexia. None of them by themselves explain it all. And for each individual dyslexic learner, it is probably some combination of 2 or 3 of those theories working together which causes the issue. One of the things that people had suggested for about 100 years was that the dyslexic brain worked differently to the non-dyslexic brain, and until we had MRI scanning machines, there was no possible way of proving that. However, we looked at this slide last time, which suggested that there have been a number of large-scale studies in different parts of the world where they have scanned people reading, and they put these people into 2 different categories: the typical readers, in other words non-dyslexic, and the dyslexic reader, and scanned what the brain was doing during the reading process. And these are amalgamations, these images on the slides, but I think they do give a good representation potentially of what is going on. And we said then the typical reader, the non-dyslexic reader, was using at least 3 different parts of the left hemisphere of the brain when they were reading. So this area at the back was the occipitotemporal area. This is where we store our memory of images, for example. So you come across a word and you open that kind of filing cabinet of information. Have I seen that word before? Or have I seen a word that looks like that before? The one in the middle was the parieto-temporal kind of store. This is our kind of filing cabinet of sounds. So you've kind of opened one cabinet of information where you've kind of scanned through it very, very quickly. I think I've seen this word before. You've then opened another filing cabinet where you've stored your memories of sounds, and you've gone, yeah, I think I've heard this before. And you've used that visual and that auditory clue, and you've sent the information to that area at the front of the brain, Broca's area, which articulates speech. The dyslexic readers then, we can still see Broca's area being used. However, the 2 other parts of the brain were not lighting up, or was not lighting up to the same extent. So the scans don't suggest that the dyslexic brain is missing those areas, but potentially the challenge is the dyslexic brain finds it harder to access those areas, or potentially finds it harder to access those areas quickly enough to support fluency when we're reading, for example. Okay, so that's kind of where we got up to last week. I suppose we also talked a little bit about assessment. We talked about the fact that it was an educational diagnosis rather than a medical diagnosis because it's not an illness. And we talked about some of the challenges that a dyslexic learner might face in the classroom, and many of these are to do with memory. So following a set of instructions that the teacher's given at the start of a lesson. So if you think back to when you were in school, how many instructions did you get really quickly at the start of a lesson? Okay, good morning, come in, sit down, get your book out, put your bag under the chair, turn to page 36 in the textbook, copy the date and heading off the board, read paragraph 1 and then answer questions 3, and then I'll come round and see you. There's a lot of information there to process. Okay, some learners might have kind of forgotten where they were after saying good morning. So potentially challenges in relation to memory. Some of those markers we saw then, those learners who were really good orally but found it difficult to put things down on paper. Potentially those learners who found different ways of trying to disengage during literacy tasks. So that learner who always needs to go to the loo when you give them a reading task, that young learner who always needs to sharpen a pencil and does so for about 20 minutes when you give them a writing task, that person who's now starting to get a little bit anxious and starts to kind of play up, for want of a better word, in class, because being sent out is better perhaps than being seen to sit there struggling. And then we very briefly mentioned some examples of supportive strategies. So we talked about very basic things, for example, things like having different colour backing paper. We can talk about changing the fonts, for example, on PowerPoints or on handouts. Potentially we could think about where we're going to get the learner to sit in the classroom. And then there may be other things that you might want to consider. For example, does your dyslexic learner that you meet on the day, do they need access to a screen reader, for example, if you're giving them a literacy task to do? Do they need access to an iPad so they can type up their work rather than physically handwriting? Okay, so that's what we kind of looked at last time. We said then that dyslexia came in the cognition and learning broad category of need. In other words, those learners who found it more difficult to learn or learnt at a different pace to other learners of the same age. And dyslexia then was an example of a specific learning difference. In other words, it focused on a specific area of learning. And we said then dyscalculia was another one, as was dyspraxia, as was dysgraphia. However, one of the problems many learners face is that the characteristics linked to each of those kind of spreads right across all of them. So that dyslexic learner might have spent an awful lot of time and energy learning strategies that supports their reading and spelling, but really struggles when it comes to mental maths, for example, because of the difficulties in processing and memory of the steps that they've taken. So we might miss their literacy needs and go down the dyscalculia route, which again is more difficult to get an assessment for. Equally, that dyspraxic learner, for example, might struggle with writing or reading, despite the fact that they are not dyslexic. So we've looked at these broad areas of need briefly. So cognition and learning was dyslexia. We're going to focus a little bit on communication and interaction today. We're not going to look at speech and language needs, but we're going to look at autism as an example of a need that also fits into that category. Next week, we're going to look at sensory and or physical needs. And we said then there's another category where potentially we used to see these learners as kind of challenging behaviour or learners whose behaviour was difficult. We used to talk about social, emotional and behavioural difficulties. We used to talk about emotional and behavioural difficulties when I started teaching. Before that, we used to be talking about maladjusted children, those children who were refusing to behave in an appropriate way, even though they knew it was wrong to act in the way that they did. So an area where it's quite difficult, I think, to find a positive perspective towards these learners, because in many cases they are seen as being more challenging to you as a practitioner, and as a result potentially are very misunderstood and perhaps at the most risk of exclusion in education, as well, as you well know, Flo, thinking about the experiences that you've had. So you will have seen, or some of you will have seen this slide or similar previously. So every year in January, schools have to publish their kind of annual census of learners. The most recent figures came out in July 2025. This year's figures will come out closer to the summer, but these give a good idea, for example, of the school population in Wales. So we got about 460,000 pupils of school age in Wales, so continuing to fall in terms of total pupil numbers as our demographics as a population change. Number of schools has more or less stayed the same. But a couple of things to note really. One of them, as we've mentioned before, is that huge drop realistically in terms of the number of learners who are diagnosed with ALN. So we've lost nearly 50,000 learners over the last 4 years. So realistically they haven't gone anywhere, but why may they no longer be being identified? Or are they being identified but their needs are being met so they don't fit the definition like they used to? And then what we've got on the graph there are some very broad figures in terms of the main areas of need we see in school, and some of these I think are probably quite realistic, others though I think we could probably take issue with. So if we're thinking about at least 10% of the UK population being dyslexic, we've only got, 2,305 learners who have been identified as dyslexic as schools in Wales, apparently. Okay, where potentially we would be thinking about 46,000 or so. All right. Dyscalculia, 165 pupils. So again, probably about 5 to 10% of the population is dyscalculic. Why have we got such a really small number that have been diagnosed? Okay. So broad areas of need, then communication and interaction. So as we said, the main one is speech and language, which, going back to that slide, is the most common area of need in schools in Wales, and in particular in primary schools. As we get into secondary school, bless you, we start to see, bless you, bless you. That was a kind of triple sneeze, that, Jess, that was impressive. So as we get into secondary school, we start to see more in terms of the behaviour. We start to see a bit more in terms of autism. We start to see a bit more in terms of dyslexia, potentially thinking about those journeys through assessment and diagnosis. Bless you. You've gone for the quadruple. Okay. So the reason why kind of autism then fits under this broad area of need, is because learners who are autistic may experience challenges in relation to communication and interaction. So some autistic learners may be non-verbal, some autistic individuals may be limited verbal. You're going to go for number 5, Jess?
Honestly, it's coming.
Let's go. Yeah. So we could be non-verbal, we could be limited verbal. Potentially there are challenges in relation to understanding interactions with other people. So that's one of the characteristics that is looked at in terms of assessment and diagnosis, for example. And a key one that comes up a lot in terms of definitions, but perhaps is a little bit more contested today than it's always been, is in terms of imagination, and in particular in relation to imaginative play. And there's all sorts of research out there that talks about the fact that people who are autistic lack imagination and can't play imaginatively. However, there is starting to be kind of a change in that narrative in terms of actually, yes, there is imagination, but it's different. So I think our kind of understanding is increasing as we continue. So that's kind of what we're looking at today. Increasingly, and again some of you have seen this slide before as well, we are seeing the term neurodiversity being used. Now, we looked at labels a few weeks ago and talked about the potential advantages and disadvantages of labels. Neurodiversity then seen as a label that was trying to be helpful in that everyone is neurodiverse as a population, I suppose, but still puts people into 2 categories: neurotypical, so the majority of people think and work cognitively in this way, and then those individuals who are neurodivergent. It's nearly coming then. No. Yeah, you're poised, ready to go then, Jack. So within that neurodiversity label, then we can also put in learners with dyslexia from last week as well. So what is ASD? So there's been different terminology that we've used over time. We used to talk a lot about Asperger's syndrome as well, which is diagnosed in the UK since 2013 now.
What do they not?
So it comes under now the broader term ASD.
Oh, okay.
So, So there'd been all sorts of debates as to whether Asperger's was a subtype of autism or whether it was a less severe type of autism, and the kind of category has gone now, well, this is autism and it all comes under that same umbrella. So before 2013 it was possible to get the Asperger diagnosis. Since then, not so much. So people will have diagnosis along the lines of this person is on the autistic spectrum. You know, potentially we still do have practitioners talking about, well, you know, previously this would have perhaps have been more likely to be Asperger's, but it's still under that kind of spectrum today. Okay, so I just put some kind of facts and fictions on there. Realistically, if you look at it, you see I've only tweaked what we did last week in terms of dyslexia, really. But again, just trying to note, I suppose, that autism is still very much a misunderstood area. It's an area where there are all kinds of stereotypes and myths and misconceptions. Although we don't have time this morning, I've embedded quite a few hyperlinks on the PowerPoint for today if you want to go back and look at these. So under the big autism picture on there is a short video, for example. But yes, Temple Grandin, I think she's fab. Yeah. She is the cattle crusher lady, So a few pictures on the slide there. So I'm old enough to remember Rain Man as this film with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise when it came out in the late 80s. It was one of the first pieces of cinema, I suppose, which had an autistic character as one of the main characters. So Dustin Hoffman was an autistic individual who was seen as having these savant abilities in terms of maths. And Tom Cruise's younger, slightly dodgy brother takes him to Las Vegas to kind of count the cards and beat the casinos. And they were going really, really well until Raymond, the brother, gets seen doing it. And it all goes wrong at that point. So all sorts of misconceptions about autism. I think it did a lot to raise awareness about autism when it came out. But all sorts of misconceptions. So for a while it was kind of known as Rain Man syndrome, for example. Every autistic individual had this savant ability in something, which is not true. And then there are some other people on there that you might have come across. So agree with Flo, lady at the top of the screen there, Temple Grandin. I think she's fascinating in two areas, really. She is twice over a professor in two different fields. So she is autistic and she is kind of a leading academic in relation to lived experience of autism, but she is also one of the world's leading experts on animal husbandry and in particular rearing cattle. And she invented something which is commonly known as the cattle crush machine, for example, which is used to kind of keep cattle calm when they're being given injections and things like that. And very much links to, have you seen, Flo, you might have seen them in the PRUs, the kind of the furniture we can sit in, it's like the hug chair. So similar kind of principle, that kind of feeling of safety and security, of being kind of held tight. Stephen Wiltshire, the chap underneath, you might have seen him on documentaries on Channel 4, for example. He is kind of a non-verbal artist. He has kind of a photographic memory. Most famous documentary was he was flown over Manhattan on a 5-minute helicopter ride and was perfectly able to replicate the entire city scene. And kind of paint it. His paintings now go for thousands. And then we kind of got Sheldon Cooper from the Big Bang Theory, again, kind of, I suppose, perhaps more what we would see as Asperger's traits, but again, perhaps more being seen in the mainstream. So, what I've got for you on that fact or fiction sheet, we've got 20 statements on there like last time. Can you just have a quick look through those and see what you think? Do you think these are fact, these are fiction? Now again, the fact that some of these have got words like all probably means it's not necessarily a fact, but maybe a myth or a stereotype. However, stereotypes do come from somewhere and do have some kind of element of support before they become a stereotype, I suppose. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes and then we'll go through and see what you think. Okay, I'll give you another 30 seconds or so and we'll go through. Okay, so the first one then. ASD, autism, neurodivergence is rare. No. So again, I suppose it depends on your definition of rare. Most common figures that we see in the UK suggest about 1 in 100 of the population potentially on the ASD spectrum. However, within that spectrum, that's quite a wide range in terms of levels of severity. So we're looking at about 700,000 individuals within the UK potentially, if we take that kind of 10% or 1 in 100. That's 1%. If we take that 1% kind of figure. So the second one, autism is linked to intelligence. No. So again, like dyslexia, no link to intelligence. There may be challenges in terms of communication and interaction, which means it's difficult to evidence that intelligence at times. However, not necessarily a link. Autism can be diagnosed by a teacher. So we said last time dyslexia was an educational diagnosis. Potentially teachers have a part to play in that, and specialist teachers might be doing the assessment. ASD can't be diagnosed by a teacher. However, teachers, teaching assistants, parents might be part of the diagnostic process in terms of filling in questionnaires and checklists and observations, for example. Autism does not exist. No, okay, so I think probably in the room we all agree that it does. However, there are people who don't agree that it does, or people who don't agree that it exists to the level of prevalence that we have today. Autism is more common in boys. No, so probably more commonly diagnosed in boys, potentially to do with how boys and girls present some of the characteristics in relation to autism. Again, like dyslexia, maybe that perception that it is a boy area of need means we look for it more in boys. probably again about 50-50 in terms of gender prevalence, but certainly almost 4 times as many males as females get diagnosed. ASD can be cured. No, so it's not an illness. There is no cure for autism. Again, if it's a difference, should there be a cure? I don't think we look for cures for difference in other kind of areas of need. However, there is areas of research looking at kind of medication and thinking about whether some of the characteristics of ASD not being cured but can be kind of lowered, or the severity or the impact can be lowered. So again, I'm old enough to remember the kind of craze towards omega-3 fish oils, for example, in the early 2000s, in terms of that was kind of pretty much everywhere. And anytime we went into a chemist or a pharmacy, there was the omega-3 fish oils as a cure for dyslexia and as a cure for autism, which they don't. However, they do seem to have some impact upon brain function. People with ASD are all hypersensitive to lights and or sounds and or smells and or textures and or pain. So the problematic word there is all. So some might be hypersensitive to one of, some of, all of those things. Equally, some individuals with ASD might be hyposensitive and have no understanding or feeling of pain. So thinking about someone that I'm working with at the moment, for example, she's writing a book about her experience as being a mother of an autistic child, talking about the fact that when her son was little, he fell over in the playground in school and broke his arm in a few different places, but didn't seem to notice that he had. So absolutely no feeling of pain at all, even though his arm was hanging off at a funny angle, was her wording for it. ASD is hereditary. So it does seem to run in families, but again, just because you have a autistic individual in the family, it doesn't mean that further children are going to be. Learners with ASD do not have imagination. So this was commonly seen as being true for a long time. However, there is perhaps a growing understanding that imagination might be different. So potentially learners who are autistic experience imagination in a way that's different to non-autistic individuals. So rather than a lack of imagination, it's a different imagination. ASD can impact upon communication and interaction, yes. ASD individuals have a superpower ability. So some may do, and I suppose again it depends on what we mean by superpower ability. Potentially, if we think about one of the traits is having a fixated interest in something, potentially developing that massively in-depth knowledge and understanding about what sometimes are quite niche topics could be seen as being a superpower, but not all individuals having that kind of Rain Man, savant, maths genius kind of ability. Individuals who are ASD are more likely to be dyslexic.
I said yes because of like the code mobility.
Yeah. So statistically this is true. So if you have one of these areas of need, you are more likely statistically to have a comorbid need as well. So if you are dyslexic, you are also more likely to have ADHD, you are also more likely to have dyscalculia, for example. But it's not a given, but statistically it's more likely. ASD is caused by vaccines, e.g. the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. Okay, now again, I'm old enough to remember this blowing up in the news with Dr. Andrew Townsend? Not the same as Andrew Townsend in the education department, but published a report talking about the fact that ASD may be caused by the measles, mumps, rubella, the MMR vaccine. And this, I suppose, was a flawed piece of research in a number of ways, in that the research didn't show that in one quite clearly, but also perhaps it was a piece of research that showed things that happened at the same time but were not causally linked. So one of the pieces of information, I suppose, that underpinned his research was we started to see these traits becoming increasingly prevalent from about the age of 18 months to 3 years of age, which is kind of the same time frame as people have the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. And his publication kind of made the link between the two, rather than we saw these traits developing kind of at the same time but not causally linked. And his research has been problematic for a long time, really. It's had a massive impact in terms of take-up rates of vaccinations globally. Potentially was one of the studies that was wheeled out during the COVID pandemic, for example, in terms of a narrative against vaccination. And we are starting to see for the first time, really, a massive increase in measles cases in the UK, parts of Europe, America in particular, where parents have been scared off giving the vaccine as a result of research as his. And we had, I think, the first child death from measles in the UK in Liverpool last year in decades, for example. So we are starting to see longer term knock-on impacts of his kind of narrative that got published. There is an ASD epidemic. Okay, now depending upon what kind of newspapers you read or articles you look at, there is kind of a growing outcry on platforms like X, for example, going, there are too many people who've been identified with autism, it's an epidemic, it must be something to do with the water, there must be something to do with the vaccines, it's probably something to do with the COVID vaccines, or something I'd seen the other day. No, we don't have an epidemic of autism. Are we seeing people increasingly diagnosed? Yes. Is that because of better understanding? And again, you see people of a certain age, very often my age, which is quite depressing. When I was in school, we didn't have people who were autistic, we didn't have dyslexic learners, we didn't have transgender learners in class, for example, but we did have so-and-so who was absolutely fixated on steam trains. I mean, yeah. So potentially there has been a rise in diagnosis because there is better understanding of what we're looking for, and potentially people's needs are now more visible than they were previously. Autism is a result of poor parenting. Okay, so in the 1960s we commonly talked about refrigerator mother syndrome, for example. So these children don't seem to want to interact with other people because they had very poor early interactions with their mother figures. Therefore they hadn't learnt that need to, or the reciprocity of human interaction. So quite quickly debunked. But potentially autism is not caused by poor parenting. However, poor parenting or inappropriate parenting can have an impact, but is certainly not a cause. There are a range of tests that can diagnose autism. Okay, so I suppose this one depends what you mean by test. So realistically, what we tend to have when we're assessing autism is a range of checklists and observations. So do learners show these particular traits, or some of these traits, do they show them in particular settings? If they do, if we can tick those boxes, then the chances are this is autism that we're looking at. However, there is no autism blood test, there is no autism test that people do. So again, I suppose it can be open to interpretation. Okay. ASD first noted in the 1940s. So this one is true, I think. So we had two groups of people we'll mention shortly who were doing research at similar times in different parts of the world, who started to print studies based on some of these traits. So autism has probably always been there, but maybe we started to recognise it in the 1940s. We're increasingly recognising it today. Perhaps we've got a better understanding of what it was compared to previously. And again, I suppose this next one depends on your perspective. ASD will have a negative impact on self-esteem. So could do, might not do, might have no difference at all, depending upon the individual. Potentially autism could have a positive impact on self-esteem if you identify with that community. Equally, there are people from that community who choose the neurodivergent label over autism, for example. All ASD individuals lack empathy. Okay, so again, I would say all is problematic there, but a trait and characteristic is that lack of empathy. However, that is on a spectrum as well. And then finally, ASD is a disadvantage for life. It depends on whether you see it as being a disadvantage or not, I suppose. So it's going to be lifelong. There may be different challenges that impact at different points in people's lifespan, for example. So potentially we are seeing an increasing number of adult females being diagnosed with autism. Is that as a result of greater understanding? Or is that as a result of the kind of strains and challenges of daily life that impact on women at different points during the lifespan, which means some of the traits become more obvious as a result of certain conditions. Okay, so in terms of ASD, then, as we said, it's kind of an umbrella characteristic. Now, these are some of the kind of conditions that are seen underneath that characteristic. So Asperger's, that had been seen as separate, is now under that umbrella term. And again, there is kind of increasing amounts in the literature as to whether we're talking about neurodivergence. And again, all sorts of debates about whether that's too broad a term to be useful or not. Quite like this one. This is a Maori word for autism, and I'm going to try and say this. Taki Watanga, which literally means that person who lives in their own time and space. So I think that's quite a nice way of looking at it, really, that person who is quite inward focused, that person who does things in their own way, in their own space, in their own time. I think that's kind of quite a poetic way of looking at it, and kind of sets it out quite nicely, really. Seems far more positive than somebody having a disability or a disorder, for example. Okay, again, some of you will have seen these slides previously, so apologies for going over things again, but this next few slides are looking at experiences of autistic individuals in school. Now, these have been updated over the years and seem to show the same kind of patterns, really. So one useful website to try and find information in relation to the in-class test is the NAS, the National Autistic Society. They are quite useful in terms of broad strategies, broad guidance, and they publish surveys where they talk to young people who are autistic, and their parents about experiences in school. And one of their biggest surveys was back in 2021, so slightly elderly now, and again kind of in the context of the COVID pandemic at the time as well. But from parental perspective, quite damning in terms of what parents felt the support their child or children had received. So about 74% of parents suggested that schools didn't fully meet their needs. Over 40% felt their children's needs generally were not being met. About a quarter had waited over 3 years to receive support. Okay, now being from a part of Wales where at one point there was a 7-year waiting list just to get the just to see the paediatrician to start that process. So those figures are quite damning. So over that 3-year, 4-year, 5-year, 10-year potentially period to get that support diagnosis, what support, if any, is in place? About 50% weren't satisfied with what support was there. And then about a third in particular, Jess, thinking about your interest here, knew about how to kind of appeal in terms of showing their dissatisfaction. Thinking about what children and young people themselves said. Okay, so again, probably nothing that we wouldn't expect here. About 70% said school would be better if their teachers understood autism. Okay, about half said they didn't have a quiet place to go to at school. So one of the strategies you might want to think about for one of the autistic learners, maybe you've got a quiet area in the classroom, in the lesson plan, that the learner can go and sit in if they feel overwhelmed, for example. Nearly 50% said, actually, do you know what, we need support with planning for adult life. Yes, I want to live independently when I leave school, but I'm not sure how. 8% other pupils and students knew enough. Okay, so 90% plus felt that their peers didn't know enough about autism, therefore their peers didn't understand them in school. About 50% wanted support in terms of developing friendships. So difficult to kind of form a friendship, even if you want to, if you don't understand the social cues, and if the way you present yourself is different to what people might expect. And then I like this quote from a primary school pupil: everyone should be trained in autism in school, then it would be a lot easier. And I agree in terms of that, in terms of staff, but also raising awareness amongst peers and pupils as well. And then a little bit more information. 86% of these learners wanted support about making friendships but didn't get it. 84% wanted access to short breaks outside the home, so that kind of respite for themselves and family members. 81% wanted support for play or facilities outside of school but didn't get it, for example. And over 50% of these learners still weren't getting support for their speech and language needs. Okay, so seemingly big gaps in terms of what these learners felt they wanted and what they were receiving in schools. Okay, I will pause for a break shortly. Just a bit of kind of introduction in terms of where does kind of autism and our knowledge come from. So I suppose two key figures at the start of this kind of narrative about autism. The first was Leo Kanner. And Leo Kanner published research in the early 1940s with a group of children that he was working with in America, and he talked about them as having a condition which differs so markedly and uniquely from anything reported so far. Each case merits a detailed consideration on its own respect. So in other words, each of these learners he was working with, or children that he was working with, in a kind of a paediatrician role, were so different that they were kind of unique cases. And he kind of came up with the term infantile autistic spectrum. All right. We then had Hans Asperger, okay, who was working in Europe, in Austria in particular, so Asperger syndrome named after him, not surprisingly, and he was working with similar learners as Leo Kanner at a similar period of time. However, perhaps these individuals would be seen as having needs that were less severe. So potentially these learners were verbal, they were willing to speak, they were able to talk, but in particular he talked about them as being little professors. In other words, having those kind of niche interests that they were kind of fixated upon and would talk at length about. And we didn't really know that much about Asperger syndrome until the early 1980s in particular, largely because his work was published in German initially, and until it was translated into English at the end of the 1970s, his work wasn't that well known. And then I'll just do one or two more slides and then we'll stop for a break at that point. Okay, so two authors which moved the debate onwards at the end of the 1970s were Wing and Gould, and in particular they came up with the triad of impairment in terms of characteristics that these individuals would express. And they suggested that all individuals who we would today see as being neurodivergent or on the autistic spectrum could be placed into three different groups depending upon how they acted socially and in terms of their communication and interaction. So again, these were the terminology is of its time, quite 1970s really. So the first group were the aloof group. So these were these learners who didn't want to interact with other people. In many cases became quite distressed when people tried to interact with them, very inward looking, very little in terms of communication and interaction with other people, and potentially, as we said, that communication and interaction attempts with them was stressful. We then had the passive group, so maybe not quite so severe. So these were individuals that could potentially, they felt, engage and interact with others, but didn't actually seek it out themselves. So they would be quite happy sitting there by themselves, not talking to anyone, but if someone tried to communicate with them, they wouldn't become distressed as a result. However, they didn't seek out that interaction themselves. And then the lovely named the active but odd group. So those are those learners perhaps we would see as being more kind of Asperger's traits, who were quite happy to talk to others, however, kind of on their own terms. So this person who would come up to you, Alex, and have that kind of monologue about their interest in 1970s Triumph Spitfire cars, for example. And no matter what you tried to talk about, they would bring the conversation back to that. Okay, so that's what they kind of saw as being the kind of different levels. They talked about the triad of impairments. And the triad of impairments very much influenced how individuals were assessed right up until 2013. So we were looking at impairments in social communication. So that individual perhaps who has limited speech or no speech, potentially that learner who repeats that same word or noise over and over again. Potentially lack of facial expression. In terms of impairment in social interaction, so a challenge in terms of regulating their own emotions, potentially feeling distressed if they have to participate with others, potentially prefer to be alone, didn't necessarily develop relationships with others, potentially struggle to understand the body language and social cues and facial expressions of others. So that person who was kind of fixated on their interest and has spent half an hour talking at you hasn't recognised that sense of boredom which is coming across in your face, or the fact that you've turned away from them means that you're no longer listening, for example. And then this was seen as being prevalent at the time, the impairments in imagination. So difficulty in terms of thinking of abstract terms. Inability to imagine situations not part of the daily routine. Since 2013, we now have the dyad of impairments. So we've gone from the triad to the dyad. It's the same areas realistically, but kind of grouped together differently. And this is from the DSM-5, which I'll mention when we come back after the break, which is the main way in which we diagnose individuals in America and the UK as well. Couple of things that are key, I suppose, in terms of this. One of these is persistent. Okay, so these traits, these characteristics we see with individuals have to be persistent, either historically or currently. And persistent is seen as being for a minimum of 6 months. So this is that person who always gets distressed when somebody tries to communicate with them, and we've seen this behaviour consistently and persistently. If it's not persistent and it's seen as being less than 6 months, then potentially it can be as a result of circumstances that learner's in at the time. So maybe that learner who was very chatty before they started school and is no longer speaking, potentially that's as a result of some kind of trauma, or in terms of processing that change and going to school, for example. So it has to be persistent, and the second part, it also has to be in multiple contexts. So we see these behaviours in school, but we also see these behaviours at home. We see this behaviour in one classroom, but we also see it in another. We also see these behaviours when the individual is outside of home or school and perhaps is in kind of general wider society. Okay, so what we're trying to do, I suppose, with these kind of checklists and observations is try and rule out the fact that these behaviours are time or context specific, And if we see some of these traits and characteristics over a longer period of time and in multiple settings, then in terms of ticking the boxes, then this may well be autism. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. So I'm going to put the recording back on, if that's all right. So before we stop for a break, then we were talking a little bit about how we've moved from the triad of impairment to, since 2013, the dyad of impairment, and in particular those looking at the same three areas: that interaction, that communication, imagination, repetitive patterns of behaviour and interest, for example. It's just kind of put together in a slightly different way, and we said there's two key features then that were important: persistent and also multiple contexts. So this isn't a short-term reaction to something that's happened. This is behaviours that are seen in multiple places at multiple times, and it's been ongoing, which suggests that it's a pattern. In terms of diagnosis then, so this one is a medical diagnosis. So with children, this is normally diagnosed by a paediatrician. Potentially children will go through specific autism services. My son, when he was little, he doesn't mind me talking about this. For example, when he was preschool, he showed all sorts of different traits that we would see as being autism. So if we walked down the street, he had to touch certain things in a certain order, and if he missed them, he'd have to go walk back and do it again, for example. Or if he got on a bus, he'd have to go up steps in a certain order and touch certain bits. Or he would play in a particular way that we might see as being stereotypical of autism. And he went to the paediatrician before he started school. We'd filled in all the checklists at home and said, we've seen these behaviours, we've seen those behaviours. There was no issues in relation to kind of communication or interaction, but there was definitely certain traits there. And he went and spent the afternoon with the paediatrician, and at the end of it, the paediatrician went, not sure what you're seeing at home, but I can't see anything in terms of those behaviours here, and he was kind of signed off. And then when he was about 16, some of these traits started to reappear, largely as a result of kind of moving from secondary school to FE college, for example, which was quite a challenging transition that he found. And we managed to get him in again to see the paediatrician the day before his 18th birthday, which was quite lucky. Otherwise he'd have gone into adult services and could still be waiting now at the age of 25. And spent an entire day. It ended up being, it was a 1 hour session, which ended up being a whole day. And at the end of it, the paediatrician went, I don't know whether you're autistic or not, but I think the best thing to say is that you are quirky. And he's 25 now and not quite sure how to process that. So he's kind of gone, okay, that's good in one way, but what the bloody hell does quirky mean? What am I meant to do in terms of that? So I think what the paediatrician was trying to say was, you know what, there is nothing wrong with you, because I think he'd gone in trying to find whether he was kind of wrong or broken in some way. And the doctor had gone, there's nothing wrong with you. You are a bit different. You have got quirks and traits and characteristics, but that's you. Don't worry about it. However, the fact that he'd had no formal kind of answer to it, he's 25 now, and it does still bug him kind of 7 years later in terms of that. So in terms of diagnosis, it is very much a checklist and observation. So parents very often will get checklists at home, and some of these are quite lengthy. Teachers and teaching assistants might get checklists in terms of filling in, do you see these behaviours in school? And if you fill some of these in, or you've seen some of these, potentially the way the questions are worded can be a little bit problematic, I think. So it uses phrases like all of the time. Or does the child always do this? And you go, well, they don't always, but they do sometimes. So if they do sometimes, can I tick it or not? So potentially, although the checklists are looking at traits and behaviours, maybe the way the questions are worded does have an impact. So there are two key assessment tools that we use. The main one is the DSM-5, the nicely named Diagnostics, the Disease Statistical Manual 5th edition. And this is what it says is characteristic of ASD. So persistent deficits. So these are ongoing, minimum of 6 months. Okay, so persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction, multiple contexts, and we might see things like difficulty in social emotional reciprocity. I can't normally say that word. So that person who finds it difficult to have that two-way conversation or to follow that structure of a conversation. Potentially challenges in terms of non-verbal communicative behaviours, so challenges around body language, so things like maintaining eye contact, for example. Okay, now I can remember working in schools and having colleagues who were kind of quite fixated on if the person wasn't looking at them, then they can't have been listening. Potentially, I'm not autistic, but I find eye contact very difficult at times because I'm really shy. So do we have features related to lack of eye contact, facial expressions, non-verbal communications, and are there challenges in terms of relationships? So either that person who doesn't seem to want to build those relationships or potentially finds it hard if they do. Another tool that we use is the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. Another lovely title. This is the 11th edition, and again similar language in terms of the definition. So we're looking at persistent deficits, the ability to initiate and sustain reciprocal social interaction and social communication, again over different contexts. And I kind of put that bit in bold at the end. Individuals along the spectrum exhibit a full range of intellectual functioning. So going back to that statement earlier, is ASD linked to intelligence? No. And that full range of language abilities. Okay, so from non-verbal to very verbal. From that ability to engage social communication to no ability to do it or no desire to do it at all. Okay. Key bit I think is quite useful as well in the second point on there. Although we typically see these traits and characteristics emerging in early childhood, so around about the time children have those vaccinations, for example, in some cases and with some people we don't tend to see these until later on in life, when kind of the demands on that person exceed their ability to engage with them. So increasingly we are seeing learners who are diagnosed with autism once they've started university, for example. Okay, so why might that be the case? What might those triggers be? So moving away from home, having bigger lecture classes, thinking about certain subjects, being in a room with 400, 500, 600 other people, all sorts of different demands which kind of overload your ability to engage with those when those traits and characteristics start to emerge. Equally, we tend to see these in females, for example, during different stages of family life. So thinking about those transitions of kind of becoming mothers, maybe those difficulties, those difficult teenage years for children, maybe increasingly with older women. There's something I was reading about this morning called miserable retired man syndrome. So that the fact that your husband has been out working for the last 30 years and is now constantly at home and is a pain in the backside, challenges around those transitions. Okay, so I've linked a video on there if you want to follow this up in your own time. It's about 10 minutes long, thinking about some of those early signs of autism, some of these linking back to very young children and babies in particular, thinking about what babies may or may not do in terms of interacting with parents. So one of those first key signs, for example, if you tend to go over to a baby and kind of open your arms towards them as if you're going to pick them up or hug them. Very often babies will kind of mirror those kind of body language. Sometimes with autistic children we don't tend to see those things. Okay, so here's an example of what the hell's going on there? So here's an example. There we go. I'm going to blame you, Jess. There we go. So here's an example of a checklist for parents. Okay, so 10 different things on here about characteristics. So she or he often notices small sounds when others do not. Okay, well, what do we mean by often? What's the difference between definitely agree and slightly agree? Okay, so there are challenges. I find these things very difficult to fill in because, well, I don't know whether I definitely agree or slightly agree, but whatever I put on there is going to have an impact in terms of the professional reading this. Okay, so she is good at social chit-chat. Okay, maybe they are some of the time. Maybe it depends who that social chit-chat is with. Maybe it depends on context, but I can't answer the context in terms of that questionnaire. So they can be challenging. Okay, so impairment in speech and social communication, so up to 50% of learners with ASD are non-verbal or have minimum language. I do like this quote at the bottom. So this was a 14-year-old autistic boy being interviewed back in the 1990s now. So very much a grown man in his 40s by this point. But the interviewer was talking to him about having conversations and chats with other people and talking about people just kind of, having a conversation about nothing really. And he responded, why should anyone ever want to do that? When I talk, it's because I want to know something or because I want someone else to know something. So speech having a very specific purpose. So not coming in and just having a good morning, how are you, how's things, what did you watch on telly last night, for example. None of that's important. I'm only going to talk if I want to find out something or I want to tell you something specifically. Common communication traits, for example, so we might see things like repetitive or rigid language. So I have a extended family member, for example, who is autistic, and very much if you visit her, she will ask you about 15-20 times an hour what pyjamas you're going to be wearing that night. Right? Or she will remember that last time you saw her, you said you were going to wear blue pyjamas. She will go, are you wearing your blue pyjamas again tonight? So there might be those repetitive or rigid language, potentially there's narrow interests or exceptional abilities, potential challenges around non-verbal communication. And as we've seen before, potentially how we use language can be problematic. So I've taken these examples, again, some of you have seen this slide before, I apologise, from the I Communicate Therapy website, which is largely to do with children with speech and language needs, but also does link to autism, thinking about the language we use and how it can be problematic. So, for example, you're working with a class of learners and you've gone, well, do you know what, we go swimming every Wednesday, which we might do, but last week was half term. Didn't go swimming on Wednesday over half term. Has that caused an issue? What if next week the swimming pool is closed on Wednesday, we have to go on Friday instead? You should always listen to an adult. Okay, what if the adult is telling you to do something inappropriate? You should not hit other pupils in the playground. Okay, fine, but you haven't said I couldn't kick them. You haven't said I couldn't punch them in the corridor. Yeah. If you stop screaming, I will let you play with Lego. Okay, does that kind of reinforce a pattern in the future? Every time I want to play Lego, I'm going to start screaming because then you're going to give me to do it. Okay, sarcasm, quite difficult to understand potentially. It's raining cats and dogs. No, it isn't. All right, so when we think about the terminology and the words we use, we might need to be a bit more concrete, for example, in terms of our speech when we are considering autistic learners in the classroom, for example. Okay, so I'm going to play a very quick video clip if this works. Did anyone ever watch The A Word when it was on? It was on BBC a few years ago, and it's set up in Yorkshire, I think, where it's looking at a family kind of coming to terms with a young son, Joe, and his behaviours which increasingly show traits of autism, and it's looking at kind of the challenges they go through as a family. So I'm going to play part of this clip. If it works.
We're willing to offer $185.
Apologies for the advert. Okay.
Okay, this is what we're going to do. 10 minutes. 10 minutes, no music. So you read a book. Or if you don't want to do that, do some colouring in, or that Lego you got for your birthday. Just 10 minutes. I'm going to use the timer.
I'm going to use the timer.
Exactly. How hard can it be? Good lad. Just 10 minutes. Mozart! Joe! Joe, turn it off. Joe, turn it off. Joe, turn it off. Joe, turn it off. Hey, Joe, no. Joe, listen. 5 minutes and then you get your music back, okay? Hey, listen, Mozart. Listen, Mozart. Hey, calm down, listen. Mozart, listen. Okay, listen, Daddy's just being silly. Here we go. Hey, music. Hey, the mighty Wah. What could be better than that? Here in my pocket, I've got the story of the blues. Yeah?
Stories to Blues Part 1 by Law, written by Pete Wiley, 1982.
Good man.
Okay. So if anyone sees it pop up anywhere, I think it is quite a realistic series. It is a drama, obviously, but I think they do give a very empathetic portrayal of autism and the impacts on family, for example. So thinking about that video, you had Joe there and his dad. So Dad was trying to work at home. Joe had been kind of listening to music. His dad comes in, tells him to turn the music off, takes his headphones off him, tells him he's going to do something else for 10 minutes. Any thoughts in terms of what happens next?
obviously I don't know this show or like how this boy portrays being autistic, but the fact that there was no real like this is happening now and then after, like that information wasn't very clear.
No.
And I mean, like,
Yeah.
music's fine. Music's not terrible.
No. No, so I think it's two fair points. There's first of all, he's listening to the music. There's kind of that question, well, was the music or listening to it problematic in any way? If so, was there any particular need to take the music away from him? He does mention, okay, that you're going to do something else for 10 minutes. Joe kind of repeats it back to him. So we've kind of got that echolalic response. So did he actually understand what Dad was saying, or has he just repeated back what Dad kind of wants him to say? And then as soon as the music's taken away, he doesn't want to read. As you said, he doesn't seem to have any concrete understanding of what 10 minutes is, what's going to happen at the end of 10 minutes, what he should be doing in that 10 minutes. There's a lot of things there that he's trying to process, and we start to see some of those behaviours that become quite challenging then whilst Joe is trying to kind of process that information. And at the end of it, the dad comes back in, gives him the music back anyway, and then we start to see kind of Joe and his kind of interest in music, and heard in the song he was able to talk about the fact that this was by the Mighty Wah, and this was the singer, and this is when it was written, suggesting that kind of almost fixated interest in terms of music, for example. Excuse me. So learners with ASD might struggle in terms of sensory processing, so potentially trying to process everything in one go. So sight, sound, smell, feel, touch, all in one go, it's too much to process, or potentially blocking out many senses to try and fixate on one particular thing. Some of the things we see can be that kind of restrictive or repetitive behaviour. So this is quite a common one on the left, for example, that young boy, they're lining up his toy cars rather than playing with them in a way that we might expect. Okay, there's a brief video on there about Holly if people want to follow up on this. This is only a couple of minutes long, and this is showing Holly getting onto a bus, for example, to go to a classmate's birthday party at a local skating rink, and the different interactions she goes through when she's there. And rather than Joe's behaviour, which was quite outwardly challenging, she kind of goes into herself, and people trying to be helpful are actually making it worse because they're trying to get this communication from her. So you might want to kind of follow up on that. You can see it's less than 2 minutes long. And if you do follow that up, you might want to kind of take a look at that and look at, can you identify some of those different areas linked to the dyads of impairment? So what can we see in the Holly video and potentially in the Joe video related to fixated interests, thinking about processing, social communication, for example, difficulties in terms of interacting and communicating with others. So again, although it's another kind of made-for-TV drama, I think it's quite a useful one in terms of seeing some of those challenges. Okay, so again, if you want to kind of watch that and follow up, there may be something in those questions there. Okay, just wanted to spend the final couple of minutes before we get kicked out, just kind of bringing this back a little bit then to your kind of lesson planning in particular. So what challenges might neurodivergent or ASD learners face in school? So on a broad scale, there are challenges relating to identification, assessment and diagnosis. Okay, so how do we identify? How long does that assessment and diagnostic process take? What support do you get or not as a result of that process? There might be challenges in terms of teaching and support. So thinking about staff's understanding or lack of. Again, we've talked previously about, do we see labels and treat all individuals the same label as the same rather than seeing the learner? There might be challenges in relation to the curriculum. So what are we teaching and how do we assess it? So if you think at the end of your GCSEs, you would have probably sat an hour and a half, 2 hour exams for most things. Is that appropriate for everyone? Is that doable for everyone? Should that be the only way that we assess? And then there's challenges potentially in relation to the learning environment as well. So as we've said before, schools are busy, loud, noisy, fast-paced environments, sometimes smelly environments. There's a lot to try and process in terms of being in that physical environment and being in that social environment. So all sorts of challenges that can have an impact. Thinking about what schools might do to support. So I've put this on here twice, I'm not quite sure why, I was obviously having a moment. So universal design for learning. So thinking about what we can do before we start delivering to try and reduce as many barriers as we can, rather than thinking about reasonable adjustments at the end. So one of the things you might be talking about in your justification is you're doing an activity with a learner, but you're going to give them multiple different ways that they can engage with it. So you want them to show their understanding of something, but they could write an essay, they could do a poster, for example. So they're showing they're learning in different ways, which means there's different ways to engage. We might be thinking about the terminology we use. So this can be a minefield sometimes. Do we talk about that student with autism? Or do we talk about the autistic student? Okay, so do we talk about, I'm just going to pick on Flo because you're in my eyeline, Flo. Do we talk about Flo who is autistic, or do we talk about the autistic student who is Flo? Who do we, or what do we see first in terms of that terminology? Do we see Flo first as an individual, or do we see autism as our primary identifier? Thinking about communication, so when you are looking at your lesson plans, thinking about how you going to set out your instructions for learners. Are you going to give these verbally? Are these also going to be visual, for example? Are you going to be using assistive technology at all? What might you be thinking about in terms of the physical environment? So if you're doing something inside the classroom, are you going to have things like ear defenders or fidget spinners, for example, available? What happens if you're going to take your learners outside? Is there something there that you might need to think about? Okay, and again, I've pinched this from a slide from the PGCE programme. What sort of things might be helpful in terms of supporting autistic individuals in the classroom? So thinking about our instructions, short sentences, clear information, not long-winded, focus on what they should be doing, not what we shouldn't be doing, potentially giving learners a choice, but maybe a limited choice. There's my alarm telling me to shut up in 5 minutes. So during the session today, you can do this or this. Okay, so it's given an element of choice, but that choice is limited. Okay, maybe we've got visual cues to support verbal information. Thinking about as many different ways for learners to show their understanding as possible. So during your session, you want them to do this at the end, but for some learners, they might show their understanding if they do it in a different way. So giving them those options at the start. Thinking about making sure you've got the learner's attention. Okay, so if Alex was autistic, specifically mentioning Alex at the start to support you, recognise that I'm talking at you or to you directly, for example. Okay, so there's a range of things there that you might find useful on that slide, in particular in terms of sticking some of those into your lesson plan with a justification. Okay. And what you'll probably find is many of those things, like the visual timetable, for example, might be useful to support more than just one learner. Okay, a couple of other things I'm just going to mention briefly at the end. I'm not going to make you watch Mr. Tumble, but Mr. Tumble from CBeebies done an awful lot in terms of supporting people's awareness of Makaton, for example, as a language. We can use Makaton in the classroom. Now again, you might say that you're going to use this in your lesson plan. Entirely fine if you want to. we might be talking about PECs. So we saw this, for example, in a way when we looked at the Ysgol video, where this was kind of maybe more digitalised, but still the learner was able to show what they wanted, which in particular was to watch the Klitschko boxing match, for example. Okay, and then I just wanted to mention this briefly towards the end. Something else that might be useful is social stories, and some of you may have come across these before, which are ways to perhaps support that more abstract ways of thinking, or to understand how other people might feel, or to understand and recognise what you could do in certain situations. Okay, so this one, for example, is looking at personal care and hygiene. Okay, you can see all of those are kind of, this is what I will do rather than I shouldn't. Okay. Social stories then aim to support learners to understand how others might think, or maybe as a way to understand changes. So we normally go swimming on Wednesday, but next week we're going on Friday instead, and we could come up with a kind of similar concrete story to that to explain and support that transition. So on Wednesdays we go swimming. Next week the swimming pool is closed. Next week we will go swimming on Thursday. Remember to tell Mum we're going swimming on Thursday. Remember to bring your swimming kit on Thursday. Okay, so those kind of concrete positive instructions. Okay, and if you want to have a go at doing some of these, again, there's a couple of other examples. Okay, so what should you do when you're trying to talk to someone and they haven't responded? Okay, so this was linked to someone who, if people didn't respond to them straight away, they tended to smack them one. So this was trying to show, you know what, you shouldn't smack people. If they haven't answered you, maybe think about this. This one was thinking about having a conversation and when you should or shouldn't speak. Good ways to touch other people at school. I'm not quite sure what I think about the wording of that one, but basically what is appropriate touch. So I can give somebody a high five, I can shake someone's hand, but I can't grab them inappropriately, for example. And then if you wanted to, there's some examples that you can follow up on there. I've put a link to a Padlet on there, so realistically you're all doing the same thing on the in-class test in different ways. As you're working through preparing for it over the next couple of weeks, if there's something that you see as being quite an useful resource, if you're happy to share it on that Padlet so that other people can see it as well. All right, and just stop talking at you in a second. I have put some links up onto Canvas as well, so not necessarily in terms of the in-class test, but these two sites are quite useful. So the first one is kind of a training activity that you can do. It takes about 30 minutes to do. This one by Autism Wales is quite useful. This is filmed in a secondary school in Llanelli, for example, and one of the learners there, called Skilty, which is quite an impressive name, talks about his experience day to day in school and what he finds challenging. So it shows him, for example, going into a classroom and somebody's sitting in the seat that he always sits in. And the teacher tells him, don't be so silly, go and sit somewhere else. And he kind of just freezes, and the teacher starts shouting at him about why hasn't he moved and why hasn't he gone to sit where he's told, because he can't process the fact that somebody is sitting where he always does. Or about him and his parents putting a timetable together about going to visit family on a Saturday, for example, so he knows what time he's got to get up, what time they're going to leave, what time they're going to go for lunch, where they're going, what time they're leaving to come home. So we can kind of process that in advance. At the bottom then, there's some examples of strategies. So there's quite a few things in there that might be useful to start off with. Yeah, and then anything that's on there that you want to pick up on, you're more than welcome to use going forward. And there then is that Padlet if there's anything you want to pop up to support each other. Okay, so next week we're going to kind of do the same as we've done over the last couple of weeks. We're going to look at physical and or sensory needs, and we're also going to touch on ADHD briefly next week as well. Okay, so other than that, thank you for listening. Thank you for putting up with me talking at you too much again this morning.